And I'll start out by saying this. Nobody likes rate increases, nor do I like giving them and presenting them to the board. I get that. So, but what we're going to start out with, I'm going to do some introductions very quickly. And we got a couple of presenters. I want to first introduce them. Jim Palmisano is the rate expert on the wholesale side for Buckeye Power. He's the most knowledgeable person in the Buckeye Group when it comes to the wholesale rates that we have to pay for everyone's usage through the co-op. And what I'm going to have Jim to talk about, because some of the farm group here may remember years ago when we had one peak of record, one demand rate. And if you weren't on it, guess what? Your cost was lower, because we didn't allocate any of that demand cost to you through your rates, because you were either in the fall doing grain drying operations and not during our summer peaks. And we're predominantly a summer peaking utility, and the whole system, Buckeye Power, is predominantly summer peaking. Jim is also going to take you through from being on a peak of record, one demand rate that Hancock-Wood got charged for everyone's load, to why Buckeye went to this, what we call a bifurcated demand. It means two demand rates. So we get billed each month from our generation company 2 demand rates. And that cost comes in a couple of $1 million a month on average is what we get billed. And then we take that cost and we incorporate that through components that you see on your bill: demand, energy, customer charge. We incorporate that wholesale cost along with Hancock-Wood's distribution cost and margin into our local co-op rates, which you pay. And then there's a PCA, power cost adjustment. We're going to get into that a little bit later when Larry and I come up and talk about the retail side. The next person I want to introduce is Larry Feltner with the Prime Group. Larry does all of our rate studies. I work directly with him when it comes to cost of service studies, which we do pretty much every year. We want to know if the costs that we're incurring as an organization, if our rates are keeping up with it. So we do a cost of service study. Larry did the most recent cost of service study last year, which brought us to this rate adjustment that goes into effect on March 1st. And as we go through this, please stop us and throw your questions out while they're on your mind. Because what I'd love to have occur is that at the end of this morning, you're going to know why we're doing this. Not just we want to give you a rate increase. We're nonprofit. I'd like to not ever put any rate increases out there, but that's not reality.
Everybody hear me? Okay, as George said, I'm Jim Palmisano from Buckeye Power. George made me feel old in his speech. I don't think he meant to do that, but he said that Buckeye was a summer peaker. For the first 25 years of my career, we were a winter peaker, and maybe some of you remember that as well. So, but I have been at Buckeye Power almost 40 years, I was telling Larry. So my parents dropped me off shortly after my birth, and I've been there ever since. So. Where's our computer here? So?
You can point up. Jim, right up here to the center.
Okay.
I think you have to use the mouse or the keyboard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. I'll say it again. If you have any questions or comments in the middle, please feel free to interrupt me. I've been there 40 years, picked up a lot of acronyms, but I still remember what it was like when I didn't know what those acronyms were. So who is Buckeye Power? So Buckeye Power is the wholesale supplier of generation and transmission to Hancock-Wood. And what that really means is we bring the power from what we have the technical term, the kilowatt-hour factories, and it takes it, we transmit it down the highway to the substations, and that's when Hancock-Wood takes it over and then delivers it to your homes and farms here. We have a contract with Hancock-Wood and the other 24 co-ops in Ohio to provide all the needs of the member co-ops till 2057. So that's almost another 40 years. So we have a vested interest in making sure we have the right investments and the financial strength to be able to maintain our end of that contract obligation. What are our resources, okay? The sort of the workhorses of Buckeyes Power's resources are the Cardinal Station. There are two, we own 2 of the 3 units down there. Unit 2 is 630 megawatts. Unit 3 is 600. Unit 3 is 630 megawatts. Those are coal-fired. Buckeye Power also has 18% ownership in the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation. That gives us 400 additional megawatts of coal-fired capacity. We also have some peaking capacity. The Moan Station in Northwest Ohio, 510 megawatts. The Greenville Station, 200 megawatts. That's in Darke County. We also have 55 megawatts of hydropower from the Niagara Falls area, and miscellaneous renewables add up to about another 50 megawatts. So plenty of capacity for the load that we have today. So when Buckeye Power decides they have to recover their costs from our members under those wholesale power contracts, what are the things we're looking at? We're looking really at 3 things. Number 1 is to recover all the costs and make a margin so that we can make investments in the future. The other one, George mentioned it, I'm sure Larry's going to talk about it, reflect cost of service. So we basically want who's incurring the cost, they should be paying the cost as much as possible. And finally, we want to send some price signals. And I realize I'm probably in everybody's way, so I'll move. What we talked about was recover cost and margin. And this is a chart going back to 1972, you probably can't read it from where you're at, up to 2017, and it shows what the average, if that's the term you prefer, and it's gone up steadily as Buckeye has made investments in more generating capacity and added more pollution control equipment on its existing plants. And now we've kind of zoomed up to about these are actually dollars. So we were covering about $20 million. Now we're up to closing in on $700 million in revenue to cover our cost of providing and maintaining our obligations to the co-ops under that wholesale power contract that runs again until 2057.
Jim, if I could add a comment for everyone. We have put, we being Buckeye Power, has made pretty substantial investments in pollution equipment on those units. Buckeye has added scrubbers on their 2 generating units, as well as made investments in the OVEC Corporation, where we get the 400 megawatt of additional coal-based generation. There was a lawsuit. The EPA sued pretty much every generating company. And this probably goes back, I may have it be off a few years, but this goes back over 12 years ago. They sued every G&T generation company that we were making major modifications by doing our typical annual maintenance on those units each year. And therefore, under the laws of the Clean Air Act, if you made major modifications on those units, then you had to bring those units up to comply with standard current day requirements, which were the scrubbers for sulfur dioxide emissions, and also we put Buckeye place SCRs, which is similar to what you have in your car, selective catalytic reduction equipment, which filters nitrogen oxide emissions out of the plant. Those units are the cleanest plants in the world today, based on having the latest technology on those coal units. And if you could compare back before that was done, back in the old days, where you see the black smoke coming out of the power plants, to today, and I've been down to the plant, it's white smoke. It's pretty clean stuff coming out of those plants. My point of bringing this up at this point in the presentation is because I think there's a total, Jim, quote, correct me if I misquote this, there's been almost $1 billion that Buckeye has had to make investments in those units with this equipment because of the lawsuit that was put against all of the generation companies. It wasn't just Buckeye. It was AEP's generating units, it was Buckeye's units, anyone that had coal-based generation. So that's been reflected in your bills over the past, I'm going to say 12, 14 years, somewhere in that range, on the wholesale side, not from the distribution side, Hancock-Wood's side. That's what you see in your PCA. When you see those PCA positive, it's because periodically Hancock-Wood will zero out that PCA. In other words, we take the cost that comes through that PCA, and when we have a rate increase, we build that cost back into the base rates. Don't increase your bill at that point. It just moves it from a PCA unit that you see on your bill to within your base rates. So I just wanted to point that out because that's a significant cost adder that you've seen in your bills over the years.
Okay. And that's exactly why that chart is shaped the way it is, for exactly those reasons. Okay, so the other thing we want to do, the second point we want to do is reflect cost of service. So basically, we can boil this down to two things. There's costs that increase as you use kilowatt hours. And obviously, fuel would probably be the most likely culprit there. So every time you need a kilowatt hour of energy, we need to produce a kilowatt hour from some fossil fuel source. That means coal or natural gas. Then there's costs that don't vary with kilowatt hour usage. Those are costs like the fixed cost of maintaining the plants, the interest we pay, the depreciation we charge on those plants. That doesn't change no matter how much energy is used. So those have to be recovered on a slightly different method. And that's George had mentioned the demand charges, the two type demand charges. That's how we recover those costs. I thought I'd put a load duration curve up and see kind of reaction that one got. So what a load duration curve simply is across the bottom we have all 8,760 hours in the year. And we've ranked from highest usage to lowest usage how much power was being used to serve the members' load throughout that year. So way up at the top here of the chart, you see we're over, it's about, I think, 1,700 megawatts. For very few hours, we used that much power. And you can see that it drops rather steeply, and there's not that many hours where we're using over like 1,400. But we're always using at least, I think that's about 550 megawatts. So we never go below 550 megawatts. So at this time, this is probably a very late evening, early morning, 3 a.m. type thing on a mild April day. This is either a very cold winter day or a very hot summer day. So on the average, you use probably about that much power. That's probably where the average is. So if everybody used the average, and we know nothing is average anymore, you wouldn't need near as much investment in plant that we have, and everybody's usage would be pretty much the same. However, this load duration curve does show that there's quite a bit of volatility throughout a year in how much is actually being used, which presents a challenge for a company like Buckeye Power when they realize that they have to provide power for another 40 years under this contract. Makes us really look out on a long-term planning horizon to see, what it is it's going to take to fulfill that obligation that we have to our members. And these are just the load duration curve notes. I think we covered all of them. Okay, finally, the third thing we try to do is send a proper price signal. So Buckeye Power has a capacity requirement in PJM, and PJM used to stand for Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland. It doesn't stand for anything anymore. It's an area of the country that goes from the East Coast and Washington, D.C. all the way up to Chicago. And all the generation and load usage in that footprint is directed by PJM. PJM is like the traffic cop that says, okay, they can predict pretty much, very closely actually, how much power is going to be needed on any given day throughout the day. And they tell then the generators to say, all right, you fire up this plant at this time, this plant at this time, this plant at this time. So Buckeye Power then has to make sure that they have the capability that when PJM calls for Buckeye to generate, we can deliver. They have very severe penalties if you do not do it, especially at the top end of that low duration curve when every kilowatt hour counts. So typically those days occur, and PJM measures the 5 highest hours. So they look at the 5 highest hours of typically the summer, and they all have to be on different days, so they can't have 2 hours in the same day. So those are typically your 5 hottest days in summer. Buckeye Power says, okay, since we have to have that much power available for PJM, we should have a price signal to our membership to either stay off that peak or reward people for staying off that peak or charging them for being on that peak. And the charge that Buckeye has determined is appropriate and has been approved by our Board of Trustees is that the carrying cost of adding a kilowatt to Buckeye's peaking capacity should be the charge, and that's about $7.39 a kilowatt a month. And that may not make a lot of sense to you right now, but that recovers about half of Buckeye's fixed costs, which are about half of their total costs. So that $7.39 is saying, all right, if Hancock-Wood can keep a kilowatt hour off peak, we're going to reward them by not charging them, right, by giving them the discount of that $7.39 a kilowatt a month.
And if I could add a comment, that's why you see through your retail rates where we're putting incentives out there for hot water tanks, for air conditioning systems, compressors, to try to be able to turn those off during the real high peaking periods. Because that's what we're saving. For every kW, and I'll give you just a quick quote and then I'll turn it back over. An air conditioning unit, standard air conditioning unit compressor, it offsets the overall demand through Buckeye about 0.8 of a kW. Hot water tank, because of the value that PJM places on hot water tanks anymore, it's very low. It's about 0.23 kW per hot water tank. So the more members who participate in that, the more we're able to offset some of the Buckeye's demand, which helps us. It helps offset our contribution as an organization, as a co-op organization, to that overall peak. And it helps us manage and stabilize costs in the long run.
Yeah, so I mean, if you added the 8, you know, the 0.8 and the 0.2, you get about $7.39 a kilowatt a month. So that's how much, you know, and that lasts for the year. So, you know, that's close to $90 a year if you can keep that kilowatt off peak. So. Okay, so Buckeye Power currently charges Hancock-Wood and the other co-ops 6 sort of unique charges on each billing system that they get each month. And there's a fuel charge, an energy charge, and an energy transmission charge. Those are the 3 charges that vary with kilowatt hour usage. So every kilowatt hour that somebody uses incurs these 3 charges. The bottom 3 charges are the network transmission charge, the PJM 5 charge that we just talked about, the $7.39 a kW month. And then we have another demand charge, which is called the 12x5 CP charge. We're going to talk about each one of these in turn. So what Buckeye's total revenue requirement is $668 million a year. And you can see that the various charges are the fuel, energy, energy transmission, PJM 5, 12x5, and network transmission, and the kilowatt hour usage. So the fuel charge, which is in our current budget year, is about $251 million. It's based on the 3-month rolling average that Buckeye Power pays for fuel. We didn't want to use a monthly average because it can be volatile, especially when you get into high cost market power and high usage months. So they try to dampen that by rolling in a 3-month average. It's charged on every single kilowatt hour sold, and it's charged on a pass-through basis. So Buckeye Power tells Hancock-Wood what the average fuel charge was for the last 3 months times the kilowatt hours they use. That's what we bill Hancock-Wood for the fuel charge. There's also an energy charge that's applied. It's intended to collect other costs that are of a variable nature, most significantly maintenance. The more kilowatt hours you generate, the more maintenance you really have to do. And we'll pick up a portion of Buckeye Power's margin through the energy charge as well. Again, it's charged on every kilowatt hour sold, and the rate is based on the budgeted maintenance and margin expenses divided by the kilowatt hours sold. So again, every kilowatt hour that we sell to Hancock-Wood is levied this charge as well. Okay. There's an energy transmission charge which is fairly minimum. Buckeye is what's called a transmission-dependent utility. We do not own any transmission facilities. We rent them essentially from the power delivery companies in Ohio, AEP, Dayton Power and Light, and those types. And they charge based on a 1 hour peak. But a portion of it, a very small portion of it, 12 million, is charged on a kilowatt hour basis. So again, we charge that on a kilowatt hour basis. And this is flattened out on a 6-month average rather than a 3-month average like fuel, again, to avoid any spikes that might occur. Now, we get into our demand charges. The network demand charge, the network transmission charge, is by far the largest part. It's 82 million. The other charge is only 13 million. So it's 87% of those charges are based on a single hour contribution. And again, that's almost always in the summer. It can happen in the winter. But when your delivery company, whether it be AEP or Dayton Power or First Energy, says this is the highest demand we've had on our transmission system, that locks in Hancock-Wood's and everybody else's contribution to that peak, and that's the basis on what they're charged for the rest of the year. So it's very important to keep that peak managed as well. So the load management programs that George was talking about apply here as well, because looking at $82 million in charges, it's much better to have. They're going to collect them from somebody. It might as well be somebody else if you can keep off that peak. And Buckeye Power passes that monthly charge through to Hancock-Wood based on that member's contribution to that single hour peak. So you got to be very vigilant when those hours are approaching and make sure that you're doing everything you can to reduce that contribution to that peak. Now the PJM5 charge, we talked a little bit about that. That was the $7.39 per kilowatt month charge. That's our price signal charge, as we said. And it's charged on the basis of your contribution. So Hancock-Wood would be roughly 5 or 4% of that amount. So they would be charged this $7.39 based on what their average contribution in those 5 hours was. So they pay that till that contribution, those hours change. So it's in a way it's saying, okay, we're going to reward you for staying off that peak, but we're going to charge you, for being on that peak as well. So it kind of cuts both ways. And the PJM5 demand charge collects a little over half of our fixed expenses. So since it only collects half, we have to find a way to collect the other half. So the other half is about $132 million, so it's no simple thing. I mean, it's something we have to spend a lot of time and think about and justify. So this is charged on a rolling 12 months. So every month we look at the 5 highest hours in the month, okay? And that we believe that represents your potential to use the power plant expenses that are there. So every month we look at those 5 hours, we roll them forward, so we have like a pool of 60 hours in there, and that average is what is the 12 by 5. That's why it's called a 12 by 5. 12 months times 5 days. That's what this charge is based on. And it's really calculated fairly simply. You just divide the remaining amount, which was $132 million, that aren't recovered through the other demand charge, and you charge them by the budgeted 12 by 5 CP kilowatt months. We try to estimate what that's going to be, come up with a rate, and that's what we charge Hancock-Wood and the other members for the remainder of those demand charges. Okay, that one's, I mean, I can ask Larry here, I'll put him on the spot, but I think there's, G&Ts like Buckeye charge, I think this is a fairly common way to recover some demand charges. Some only use a 12 by 1, they just use the 1 hour. Buckeye thought that by using 5 hours, it's more representative and sort of doesn't penalize you for that 1 hour that you might really be off kilter a little bit.
And I just want to make sure it's very clear to everyone that Buckeye, we are Buckeye's member, we being the entity, Hancock-Wood. So Buckeye charges Hancock-Wood for all of our members' usage, whether it be demand, whether it be energy. And just one other comment, when you go out on the market and you purchase power, now Jim talked about why Buckeye have to take a long-term perspective to start investing in additional power plant capacity, so that when you need it, our members need it across the state, it's there. If Buckeye didn't take that philosophy, and I want to do the converse of that, if they decided we're just going to have X amount of capacity but not enough to fulfill all of the requirements of our membership, not only today, but looking out into the future, then what Buckeye would be subjected to is the volatility, direct volatility in the market, because they would have to go out on the market on whatever day that we're at a peak and purchase power off the market. Now, you're talking about volatility through the PCA that you guys pay today. I'm going to give you some numbers. Now, granted, today, power prices are down on the market. But back in 1998, and I can't give you the name of the company that we served, but we had an interruptible rate for this company through Buckeye Power. They bought 1 hour, and they had the ability to instead of interrupting, they got a discounted rate on, from day to day. But if Buckeye needed them off its peak under a contract, they had to come off within 15 minutes and get down to a certain level of demand. What happened, they decided we want to buy through 1 hour. And because they take all of their profit that they made at the end of that year, they allocate it back out to all each of the 24 electric costs based on our use of the generation out of that plant. The more generation you use, the larger allocation of that margin. Guess what Hancock-Wood does with the margin? The actual revenue from that allocation. We go back each year and we present, with my CFO, we look at the ability of the electric co-op with all our other expenses to pay it, and we allocate it back to each and every one around this table, every member of the co-op, based on your usage of the electricity that we deliver to your businesses, your farms, your homes, and so forth. We really have, and just to put it in perspective, to sum it up, Hancock-Wood's operating margins that we generate are somewhere, the revenues are about 40 million, depending on the year and the weather and all of that, is about $40 to $42 million a year, operating revenue. The margins are anywhere between $1 million to $2 million in most years. We don't build a lot into our rate base to have significantly higher margins. There's some years a little bit more than others. The driver of that is, I can tell you the primary driver is weather, especially right now where we're not really seeing a lot of new commercial sales coming into the co-op. It's weather driven. Last 2 years, we struggled. You didn't have very much of winters over the past 2 years. And the summers over this past summer was relatively mild. Actually, both summers were relatively mild compared to other summers that we went through. So that's the fluctuation in what we see in the form of operating revenues and ultimately margin. So it's a very simple design. There's not a lot of money built in there for record profits or anything like that, because there's no motivation for us to build those into our rate base. I'll turn it back over to you because I don't want to get into the distribution until, Larry, you and I get up.
Okay. And I promised I would explain all the acronyms. The CP stands for coincident peak. So it's the 5 hours coincident with the statewide top 5 hours. It's Hancock-Wood's contribution to that coincident peak. So, okay, George talked about peak of record. And well, what happened to that? Well, back in the day, it used to be the basis for transmission expense, our operating at cost at Cardinal, which was our only generation asset at the time, and the banking and withdrawing of capacity at Cardinal. So when we first bought the Cardinal units, they were more than we needed. So AEP said to us, all right, we'll use that capacity and we'll let you bank it for when you need it later. And that turned out to be a very lucrative thing. We got the economies of scale of building a plant that was huge, but we only had the operating costs of exactly what we needed. So that was a very good arrangement for us, but that finally ended, and we'll talk about when it ended, but so at that point, the peak of record was the basis. It was a driver for almost all of our fixed expenses. So it was very easy to set a demand rate then. It was whatever a kilowatt hour added to our transmission expense, our operating cost, and the penalty it had on our banking and withdrawing of capacity. So that all changed. Well, first of all, the peak of record was a single peak. It was always in winter back then. We did not have as much air conditioning load as we do today. And it stayed in place. That was the thing about the peak of record, is it stayed in place until another peak of record was set. So if you had a record cold winter, I think 1984 was a peak that we set that we didn't exceed for at least 5 more years. So if you set a bad peak in 1984, you were stuck with it for about 5 years. So each member's contribution then determined their demand charge, and that included transmission at the time. So what happened to the peak of record? What led to its demise? Well, first of all, the transmission agreement that we had from 1960 whatever to 2003 expired. So then all of a sudden transmission was out of the equation. And then in 2006, finally that bank capacity arrangement was fully withdrawn. So the price signals were changed for the peak of record, and we could no longer rely on that to be an accurate gauge of what the members were incurring to Buckeye. So we had to change the price signals, and that's why we went to as George called it, the bifurcated demand rate, where part of it's based on the contributions to those PJM peaks, and part of it's based on the sort of the monthly rolling average of the 5 peaks. The one thing I should mention too about PJM is the PJM 5 hours are based on that whole PJM footprint's load. So if it's really, really hot on the East Coast, where they use most of the power in Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington, it can still be fairly mild here. So you may have it could be a 75-degree rainy day in Ohio, but a 90-degree scorching hot humid day on the East Coast. But we would still be, Buckeye would benefit greatly from a situation like that. But we still would try to do our load management just the same, because if we can keep it down even lower, we'll take that as well. So, I believe that's yes. And if anybody wants to contact me, any questions offline or any questions today, be glad to answer. But there's my contact information. I've been there long enough. I don't think I'm going to be going anywhere anytime soon. So, gas is cheap, admittedly. The problem with gas is when you get a really cold winter day, it's not always available. You can get cheap gas, but the delivery cost is going to put it into the stratosphere. Whereas coal, you know what the cost is. So it's another reason why Buckeye thinks coal is a great fit for its members.
So we just want to talk about what our investments have been. And these investments have been related to improving the reliability of your electric service and the electric service of the rest of our members. So really what I want to focus on is 4 areas: line rebuild, which is the overhead pole lines you see along the road; our substations, which is where we actually take delivery from the transmission system; communications, so I mean, how do we get all this information back to the co-op? And then, I'm sure you guys have heard the term smart grid on the news. We'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in that area. But first, with line rebuild, our board had a strategic planning session in 2012, and one of the things I put up for them was actually what was the condition of our overhead lines in that year. And so what we came up with, there's a laser somewhere here. If we just look in this column, this is actually a summary of what our overhead lines consisted of in 2012. So we had about 1,300 miles of overhead line, and the important part here is 9% of it was copper. And what that means to us is, the thing I'd always heard is our co-op, when they were formed in the 40s, that we never built a copper line. That we actually bought those from General Utilities, which was an investor-owned in the area at the time. So you can say, if you see a copper line, it's pre-1940, and if Alan was in here, he would tell you last year we were out on a crew audit. we pulled a pole right outside of Findlay, and it had a 1938 birthmark on it. So we do have stuff that's older than 1940 still out in the field. You can see approximately half of our system was greater than 35 years old. So we've made a recommendation in 2012 to start rebuilding 40 miles of distribution per year.
If I could add just a quick comment on that. Here's your options on the rebuild of your plant, your lines in particular. You either try to set up a plan that allows you to periodically, on an annual basis, rebuild so much at a time, or you put them back up when you have outages, when you have storms, wind storms, ice storms. But the catch is, when you put them back up during that time, you pay a very significant premium. You've got contract crews in here charging you big time bucks to put those lines up, and you have no choice because you've got members out of service. So we, in Bill and the engineering group, put a plan together that was presented to the board, and we update that plan every 3 years on how much of rebuild that we're going to, of our distribution lines that we're going to rebuild. The board approves it, and then we go out to our lender and we secure dollars over those 3 years to actually support that work.
So this is speaking a little bit to what George said. So the engineering group, which Brian Goolsby back there is one of them, we sit down and we actually do some modeling, we do some planning. So I guess what I'm trying to say, we just don't go out there and say, hey, let's start rebuilding down this road. There's a lot of engineering, and we look at outage statistics that go into selecting the lines that we are replacing. This is just a picture of some of those maps we put together. And so how that all culminated then into results is this is actually a graph. This is miles over here. This is the year. And it just shows you here in 2012, we started picking up our rebuild. Now, I say 40 miles, that's 40 miles of single phase. So we're actually budgeting dollars. We're not necessarily budgeting miles. So if we decide to do more three-phase, it's way more expensive than single phase, so we don't get as many lines, but we're basically doing the same number of dollars. This right here is really interesting, 2008, because if everybody remembers the ice storm we had, FEMA was paying for that, so that's why. FEMA paid for 100 miles of rebuild for us. So that was us wrapping up FEMA right there.
But indirectly, you guys pay for that, because that comes from the federal government.
Yeah. So it just kind of shows you, you know, we've been stepping up rebuild from what we were. So if we put that graph into a chart form, you can see over the last 10 years, we've replaced 300 and almost, you know, a little bit over 340 miles of line. Let me see if I can get this to come up. Where did it go? I had this really neat Google map that was, there it is. So our GIS department, who does our mapping for us, so every pole you see out there, every transformer, we actually collect into our electronic mapping system. So this is Findlay right here, this is Bowling Green, Fostoria, and then Bluffton, to give you some reference. So all these blue lines right here, that represents our distribution system. That represents our overhead and underground lines. And what I wanted to show you is, if I turn that off, all these lines you see are lines that we rebuilt and we replaced in the last 10 years. It's more heavily, you know, there's been more done in the north because a great big section of this was done as part of that ice storm. Just gives you an idea. We can actually, well, if I knew how to run this without a mouse, But you can actually zoom in here. If anybody's familiar with like the dairy farm up by Weston, that's kind of this area here. But they're color coded by the year. So when I hover over these, click on something. So what do all these investments add up to? Over the last 10 years, we've spent $50 million on rebuilding overhead lines and replacing underground lines. And we've spent about $11 million on upgrading substations. And so what does that mean? Since we're at like a 50% equity level, that means that half of that money came directly from the ratepayers at the time, and half of it we are borrowing through long-term debt, because we recognize, you know, if we put a new pole in the ground, it better last 30 years. So we should be borrowing money to spread that cost out over the next 30 years. So the results of this, and I won't get too deep into this, this is the year, and these are minutes. And so we track outages based on what is the average minutes of outage each member on our system has incurred. So if we look at this, we would say, it's kind of hard for me to, 2008, that we were probably averaged 130 minutes of regular outage. I say regular, but this takes out big storms. But I think really what I just want you to see is the trend is we've been reducing the minutes of outage per member. That's really what that chart's showing you. Like I said, this doesn't take into account great big storms. If we take into account great big storms, and what I mean is 2012, derecho. 2008, we had an ice storm. I think it was right around Christmas. That was a terrible one. And then in 2005, we had a FEMA event. So even if we take those into account, we've still been trending down on the average number of minutes per member. And that's really why we're doing this. That's why we've spent the money on these improvements, is to reduce outage times, reduce number of blanks, improve quality of service.
I'm Larry Feltner, and I work at the Prime Group. We're a consulting company that does nothing but cost of service studies and rate design, primarily for rural electric cooperatives all across the United States. So we do a lot of this kind of work all over the country. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about, at a very high level, kind of the process that we go through and what costs end up in each component of the rate, so that you know when you look at that customer charge, or you look at a demand charge or an energy charge, what we're trying to recover in those charges. So let's start out first by talking about just general rate design principles. And the first and foremost is we're trying to reflect the cost of providing service in the rate. There's a kind of an underlying principle when you do cost of service studies or rate design, that customers should ultimately pay the cost that they cause the system to incur. So that's what you're trying to accomplish with cost of service and rate design. In order to have fair and equitable rates, we're also trying to recover fixed costs through fixed charges, and we're trying to recover variable costs through variable charges. In other words, we don't want to try to recover a fixed cost through a variable charge or a variable cost through a fixed charge, because that wouldn't be a very fair way to do it. Another concept in rate making is what we call gradualism, which means that we try to implement any major changes in a gradual way, which gets down to rate continuity. When you do gradual changes and try to keep some kind of rate continuity, then that means you're avoiding rate shock to users of electricity. So we're trying to implement changes in such a way to balance the need for the change with the impact it ultimately has on your bill. So let's talk about fixed and variable costs a little bit. Fixed costs are costs that do not vary with the kilowatt hour sales that Hancock-Wood has. And in the utility business, we break those down into two different types: capacity related and non-capacity related. So capacity related fixed costs are things on the distribution system, for example, that we're installing to be able to handle the load that you need at your place of business or at your farm or residence or wherever you are. So we're talking about transformer capacity, line capacity, those kinds of things. There's also purchase power capacity. So we're buying power from Buckeye, and Buckeye charges us a PJM5 demand charge and a Buckeye 12x5 demand charge for that production capacity. And then we also pay network transmission charges for the transmission capacity. Okay, so those are all capacity related charges. The non-capacity related or customer related, in other words, they're more related to the number of customers that we have to serve than they are the distribution capacity that we have to build. Those are things like meter reading and billing, the meter, customer service, those kinds of things would be non-capacity related. Variable costs are costs that vary with the amount of kilowatt hours that we're selling. And really, for a distribution cooperative, there's only one, and that's the energy components that get passed through to it from the G&T. So Buckeye has three components. They have a fuel charge, an energy charge, and an energy transmission charge that Bill has already taken you through. So those are really the only variable components that we have. So what does a cost of service study do? A cost of service study is a tool that really regulators came up with over decades of regulating utilities to try to figure out, is the utility charging rates that's fair and equitable? Or are they overcharging or undercharging certain members on the system? Okay. So what it does basically is it determines if the revenue that a customer is paying or a class of customers paying covers the cost of providing service to that class. So that's in a nutshell what it does. We follow what's called NARUC methodology. NARUC is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. It's the 50 state regulatory utility commissioners. They get together, they discuss best practices in the industry for doing cost of service studies, and they actually publish a manual called an Electric Cost Allocation Manual that describes the methodologies that they consider to be industry standard practices. We follow that methodology. So in essence, what it does is it allocates a cooperative's cost to customers as fairly as possible based on their usage characteristics. Okay? So by fair allocation, what we're trying to get to, as I mentioned before, is if a customer causes a cost to be incurred by the cooperative, the customer should pay that cost through the rate. And customers would also pay any fair share of the cooperative's margins. And I want to be clear about the term margins. We've talked about margins quite a bit today. But margins with a rural electric cooperative don't mean profit. Margins are really the cost of financing. We're talking about debt and members' equity piece. Okay, so the margin that's left over would be the members' equity piece that ultimately gets returned to it through capital credit paybacks. So there's really no margins in the traditional way that we think of margins in a rural electric cooperative. Now, a cost of service study in a nutshell looks like this. So we start out with all the cooperative's costs, and we do something called functional assignment. And really all that means is we're organizing the cost by what type of cost it is. So if it's purchase power related cost, we'll put that in that bucket. We'll have things like primary distribution, secondary distribution, line transformers, customer service, meter reading and billing, so on and so forth. So we'll have a bunch of different functions, and we simply organize the accounting data by what type of cost it is. And then the second step, this middle part here, is called classification. And all we're doing there is we're further organizing the cost by what is driving it on the system. In other words, why are we spending the money? So when you get to purchase power, there's going to be demand-related costs, which is that PJM5, Buckeye 12x5, the network transmission. There's going to be energy-related costs, which are those 3 energy charges we looked at. On the distribution side of things, there's going to be some demand-related cost. Demand, when I say demand, think capacity. Think of how much line and transformer capacity that Hancock-Wood has to build in order to serve you. So that's what I mean by demand. So there's going to be demand-related costs, there's going to be customer-related costs in that bucket. And then when you get into this other category, we're talking about things like customer service, meter reading and billing, those kinds of things, which are all customer-related. So ultimately what we're trying to do is organize the data by a way that we can then logically allocate it to each class of service based on those cost drivers. So this middle category here ultimately becomes how we spread the cost to each class. So if it's a demand-related cost, we'll allocate it on each class's contribution to that demand. If it's a customer-related cost, we'll allocate it based on the number of customers in the class. If it's an energy-related cost, we'll allocate it based on the number of kilowatt hours that each class uses. So we're trying to match up as best we can how we allocate the cost of what's causing Hancock-Wood to spend the dollars to begin with. So ultimately, we get back to that guiding principle that if a customer causes a cost to be incurred on the system, they end up paying for that cost through the rate. So that's kind of the guiding principle in everything that we do. So demand-related costs, or costs that would ultimately go into the demand charge in a rate. On the purchase power side of things, we've got the PJM5 component, we've got the Buckeye 12x5 component, and we've got that network transmission component. Those are all purchase power related demand costs that would ultimately be recovered through a demand charge for a fully cost-based rate. On the distribution side, we've got things like substation costs, primary conductor and poles, secondary conductor and poles, line transformers. Those are all capacity-related expenses that would ultimately be recovered through a demand charge on a fully cost-based rate. Energy-related costs, like I said before, the only ones we really have are the ones that would be passed through to Hancock-Wood from Buckeye. And those are the purchase power fuel charges, energy charges, and the energy transmission charges. So in a perfect cost-based rate, that would be the only components down in the energy charge. Now you're going to see when we get down, because of the idea of gradualism and rate continuity, the rates aren't cost-based, so they still got a ways to go. So some of the demand-related costs are being recovered in the energy component, but that's just the nature of the beast to try to avoid rate shock to certain members on the system. The customer charge is basically everything that's left over. So it's costs that do not vary with the capacity that we have to install or the amount of kilowatt hours that we're selling. And they would include things like meter reading and billing costs, customer service, and a grid access portion. So that's ultimately the costs that go into the customer component. Now, the rates themselves, the on-peak farm rate has a customer charge of $48. Now, that particular component is very close to what the cost of service study says it should be. So it's pretty much a cost-based charge. So it's getting all those customer components that I just showed you. The demand charge of $3.05 is well below what the cost is to really recover the Buckeye charges plus the distribution capacity that we have to install. So some of those costs are being recovered down in the energy charge, which is a little over 8.5 cents. Okay.
Larry, if I can add to that, because this would be a good point for me to add. When we initially put the current rate, which was a $25 service charge, I think it was a $3.01 per kW charge, that went into effect roughly in 2014. One of the things that the board shared with me is that we cannot have a rate increase at that time. This was not a rate increase. What we did with your rate, because some of you guys around the table were on the residential rate. What we did with your rate at that time, I had Larry to design it so that you would then start seeing a demand component in your rate. But we lowered the energy charge down so that the net impact on this was pretty close to neutral. Now, it would have varied a little bit based on how many kilowatt hours you were using. Why did I do that? And that's what I'm getting to. I did that because we knew that this rate design was going to move forward in about 4 or 5 years. The board said they didn't want a rate increase for 4 years. We were getting close to one. And so we managed for an additional 4 years before we started affecting that. But the initial rate was a strongly subsidized rate. All we did was take whatever your cost was on average. That's why I said it could have varied a little bit depending on the account, whose account it was. We took that strictly energy rate that you were on under the residential rate, and we designed a demand rate that when you applied your bill to this new rate, now again, it wasn't this one, this is the new rate that's going to go into effect on March 1st. It was a $25 service charge, a $3.01 demand charge, and the energy rate I think was a little bit cheaper than that, is where the original rate was at. So we put it out there so that our farm accounts could get used to paying on demand. Some of these farm accounts have never paid based on the demand. Now you have a demand component in that energy charge. Every customer pays a demand, has a demand allocation in their base rate, including residential accounts. It's a small portion that's embedded in that energy rate that you've been paying on even prior to this. Because all of that cost from Buckeye is split up through the entire rate base. The difference is we didn't show it. We embedded it all in the energy rate under the residential rate, which several of you guys were on. Some of you guys were on. And we put this out there. Now, here's where we're at today. Today, we're saying, okay, the original rate, we need to start moving that up to more where it's covering the allocation of costs, not new costs, but the allocation of costs that we're incurring from Buckeye. One of the drivers of that is that this 12x5 demand rate that Jim shared with you earlier, that rate is primarily covering some, about half, I think is what Jim indicated, of the fixed cost of the generating plants. That's how Buckeye recoups its costs of those plants. That it's made investments, it's planned, the debt service, the interest, depreciation, all of that. No different than you guys when you buy a new combine or something. You're depreciating that combine. You're making that upfront investment in it, and you're depreciating it over the projected life of the asset. No different than what Buckeye is doing here. So I want to make sure, and that's why I wanted to stop here, Larry, to make sure where did this come from. Some of you guys were already paying on that rate. It wasn't at these numbers, but we put that in place in 2014. This is the new rate for the on-peak farm rate. And this rate also, and I'll stop here because I don't want to take your presentation, but this rate also has an allocation in it, but it's subsidized right now. When I say subsidized, let me explain that. the cost never goes away. Buckeye gives us a $2 million bill each month. We have to pay $2 million. Here's what happens if each rate class aren't fully recouping the cost that was allocated to that rate class. That cost is still being paid from Buckeye, but it's being paid and spread it over the rest of the membership through the other rate classes. So it never goes away. And I want to make that point because all we're doing as a nonprofit electric co-op is recouping those costs that were billed plus our distribution costs and the small margin requirement that we have on it. We're recouping that. And at the end of the year, we're looking at operating margins at the end of the year somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million to $2 million. In the last 2 or 3 years, it's been under $2 million because we were getting closer and closer to having the need for a rate increase. But what can offset that? What can offset that is if we start growing commercial accounts within our service territory. As we bring companies in and those sales start coming into the overall sales of the electric co-op, then those sales help to basically stabilize our rate base. So then there's not a need for as frequent of an increase at that point in time. And I can tell you for about a 10 to 12 year period prior to the recession, we were growing as an electric co-op anywhere between 2–2.5% at the low end of sales per year, new sales coming in per year. To 1 year we hit just under 7% in additional sales. I will also say to you, and I know this because I met with the director of AEP's, he's vice president of their business development and governmental affairs. And the reason why I was meeting with them is because you probably heard some of the things that went on over in Finland over the past summer and the fight between AEP and Hancock-Wood. And I made several presentations over there where they went over into our service area inside of Finland because of franchise issues. But I met with this guy, and one of the things he threw out there on the table down in Columbus with our general counsel and Buckeye's general counsel is that, George, let me just put it to you like this. The only growth area, true growth area in Ohio today is Columbus. That's not to say you're not getting a load here, you know, like a Campbell soup over in Finland, and one over here in Cleveland, and one over here. But as far as those numbers I gave you previously, you know, growing from 2.5 sales to, you know, just under 7%, it don't exist today for any utility. This is why AEP has been very aggressive going out there. Not only going into Hancock-Wood service area inside the municipality, they can't do it outside of the municipality. And I don't want to take your time in going through the legal implications. They can't go into cooperative service territory unless it's inside the municipality, because inside the municipality, the franchises governs who serves and the language in those franchises. But
is that in the city corporation limits?
yes, only within the city corp. But guess what was happening over in Finland? The limits were right here. They kept annexing right into the cooperative service territory.
I was going to say, this side of Finley's got a lot of big business coming in.
Yeah.
Now, is that part of Hancock-Woods?
Yes, part is AEP's, part is Hancock-Woods, but I'll share something with you that I mentioned briefly as we were coming back. We're doing some strategies that the board is supporting, where we have put together through our G&T's general counsel a franchise agreement that protects our territory within that municipality. Now, granted, that franchise has to be approved by the city council. We were not successful in Finley. There's a different strategy we're going to use in the Finley area. We just got one of these franchises approved in North Baltimore. And in fact, North Baltimore, we're more favorable to a lot of these municipalities than Ohio Power or AEP. the village of North Baltimore, and this is all this land right around this building included, right off of 75, they would prefer that Hancock-Wood serve just because of our relationship with the local villages and so forth. I'm working with Lipsick, you had mentioned earlier, Lipsick, Justin Barnhart. I just had him in my office here about a week ago. You know, we're not as big as AP, but we're smart. And that's the way we've got to strategize. We've got to be smarter. We have to catch them with their guard down, and that's what we're doing. So, you know, these franchises also allows us not only to protect our service territory, which is defined by the state legislature, within a village or municipality, but it also gives us, this new franchise, the right to serve anywhere. If they want us there, we can serve anywhere. Now, what my challenge is that I've got to go to what I think are municipalities who have potential for growth, and I've got to sell this franchise. That's what I've been working on with.
If you remember, I talked earlier about fairness and equity being, you want to try to recover fixed costs through fixed charges, variable costs through variable charges. And this rate, if you think back to Jim's presentation, the PJM piece, he said, was costed out at $7.39 per kW. So you could see the demand component in this rate would not even be enough to cover the production costs coming from Buckeye, much less the distribution capacity that we're installing. All those costs, except for $3 and a nickel, are down in the energy charge. So a perfectly equitable cost-based rate, this energy charge may be around 4 cents or somewhere in that range, and the demand charge may be in the $15 or something range. And what happens to you is, with this type of rate design, as you buy more energy, you pay more demand costs necessarily than maybe what you caused the cooperative to incur. So that's why it's important to have the charges as cost-based as we can. But this is where rate continuity and gradualism comes into play. What happens when you go from no demand charge or a very small demand charge to a full, say, $15 demand charge is that if you have seasonal users, people like that who don't use consistently year-round, their bill impact is a lot bigger than everybody else's. So if you set a rate where the overall increase may be 5% for the class on average, you could have users in there that may be getting 50% increases. So we set the rate like this to try to minimize, as George said earlier, any individual impact so that we can gradually over time move it to where it needs to be.
And if I could add something here, because I'm going to give you some specific numbers here. This particular rate, for those of you that fall under this rate, and there's 3 of them, and all of you don't fall under the same rate, the customer charge comes up in 1 year from $25 to $48. The demand charge today is at $3.05. That would be March 1st. It was prior to that, it was $3.01. It goes up from $3.01 to $3.05. So that's what you will see March 1st. The energy charge on this rate, what you're going to see after the first year, it goes up slightly to the 8.5 cents, like you see here from the prior rate. But going through the next 3 years, and this is why we spread it, and I want to make sure I hammer on this. I don't want, and the board don't want, for you guys to go from here to here in 1 year. And this is why we spread this out over a number of years. The energy charge, so it's going to be offset. Even though I'm giving you numbers, the impact on your bill, if any of you want to sit down with me one-on-one, of course we can't do every one today, I can actually do you a forecast, have some of my staff put a forecast together of the actual impact. We'll use your last year's data, history, and go through this. But the energy charge over the 3 years will go down. And if you remember what Larry said, this would have been around 4 cents if we had had the demand up where it needed to be. The demand will increase up to about $9.80 per kW. The energy charge will almost be cut in half, but gradually over each of those years. So to get the net impact, because I'm just throwing the numbers out, we would throw your load, 12 months of it, into a spreadsheet and say, okay, this is the actual kilowatt hours, the actual demands that they're setting, in which we know through our electronic metering. Put it into the model, and we can tell you this is what you paid last year for your total cost. This is what you're paying this year under this rate adjustment. We can do that each year.
Is everybody clear? In other words, that demand component, what we're trying to capture, even though this one doesn't do it yet, but what we're trying to capture are costs really that don't go away. So when they build line capacity, transformer capacity, when they buy purchase power capacity to serve the load, those costs don't go away if you don't buy a kilowatt hour or not. So that's why they should be up in that fixed demand component as opposed to down in the energy component where they're subject to somebody buying a kilowatt hour or not buying a kilowatt hour. Is that clear? That makes sense to everyone?
And let me add one last comment so that you know, because I'm not telling you who falls under this rate. We have it. This is an on-peak rate. This is for an account that you're setting your demand over 50 or over kW. During the months of May 1st through September 30th. Now, if you're a typical grain operator, and that's going to be more Derrick-based accounts. If you are have a farm account that you're setting your highest demands traditionally in the fall, grain dry, you won't be on this rate. And we'll get to that as we go through the next two. So I'm just giving you, for those you know who are in your operations when you really are using a lot of electricity, setting demands, that gives you kind of an idea whether you fall on this particular rate or not.
And this is based on the GS9M rate with the PJM cost removed from the rate. And if you remember, Jim was talking about the PJM piece happens in the summer months. So the idea with this rate, as George kind of alluded to, is if you're peaking in the fall and you're not peaking during those summer months, then in theory you're not causing Hancock-Wood to incur any PJM5 costs because your load is naturally down during those summer months. So this rate is designed for those customers who are peaking basically in the fall months and are generally off that PJM5 demand during the summer months. And like I said, it is the GS9M rate, except we took the PJM piece out of the demand charge. So we end up with a $60 customer charge, a $7.01 demand charge, and 6.3 cent energy charge.
And I will add a comment here. For those who are on this rate, current rate, this is the new rate effective March 1st, you're going to see a decrease in your rates because we have pulled out the PJM component. Now it's not a net decrease, it's a decrease in your demand component of your rate. That demand goes down quite a bit. Then we get hit with costs. And let me explain this. Those transmission peaks are set during that May 1st through September 30th. When we hit the following year, whatever Hancock-Wood's contribution to that overall transmission peak, that becomes, I would consider it like a floor for what we're building on each year in that area. So if during the winter months, of course, we're not winter peak, guess what? We're going to be somewhere below that, but guess what? We're going to be built at that level until a new peak is established by Hancock-Wood in the following summer. So it behooves us to try to get our membership to be able to control some during those time frames. And the only reason why some farm accounts don't fall under that, because they have your more traditional grain drying type operations. And they really don't set a very high demand during those 5 months. Yes, sir.
Every now and then we take corn off in September, and the meter just starts to run hard. But that could be 1 year out of 5 to 7 years.
We've taken care of it. I'm glad you brought that question up. Here's the deal. We built to the rate for exactly that circumstance, that if you only hit it one, I think it's 2 times, wasn't it, Robin, that we put in there? Two or 3 times that we put in the rate language. And it's just incidental, then we wait. You've got to hit it like it's either 2 or 3, don't quote me on that, 2 or 3 times in a row, years in a row. Before now, you basically have shown us that this is going to be your normal peak. So we took that into account, because anyone could hit it 1 time, you know, and maybe 2 times. But as long as they're not consecutively, then we kind of wait. We don't push you up to the next rate.
So don't plant early corn every day.
Yeah. but I think you can see, we don't want to give you a rate increase. We're just trying to recover costs, and we're trying to build some things into the rate design, just like what you indicated, that, you know, if one time you go over that, then we're going to wait, you know, and keep you on that rate, not put you on the next higher rate.
Now, these first 2 rates are rates for over 50 kW of demand. This final rate are for folks under 50 kW, and it is based on the GS8M rate. $40 customer charge, and there's no demand charge here. So it's all in the energy. So all those demand costs we talked about, they're all down in the energy component, because there's no demand charge to recover them through. So if you're served at secondary voltage, the energy charge is a little over 9.5 cents. If you're served at primary voltage, it's just a hair over 9 cents.
And we started out with just a slight increase in the energy rate, but I want to share with you, just so that we don't induce any rate shock. This is how far we went out to adjust this rate so that it is covering the allocated costs for that rate group. We went out 10 years where there's a slight adjustment in the energy charge, and I'm going to give you the full impact over the 10 years. This energy rate only goes up 2 cents over a 10-year time frame. That's it. So, you know, I hope what you're seeing is that we have really put a lot of thought into this so that we don't induce any type of rate shock, you know, on any of our farm groups. Will rates go up? Yes. Will it cost you more money? Yes. But we've tried to design strategies into these rates so that you're not going to get rate shock year 1, you know, or year 2. So we spread it a small amount over the next 10 years. And I won't repeat what Larry and also Jim has said about where you put the various types of costs in the right buckets. But let's just start there. We've assigned all the customer costs, the meters, the customer service, all of those things. One big pocket. Then we've allocated a portion of each of the rate classes, which are under the farm rate lines. Then the way we recoup this, there's only 2 ways. Based on that cost that's been allocated to that class, it has to be paid by the group of ratepayers in that class. Second option we have is that even though you're only using 1 light bulb for that one service. And we got a service, we built capacity in the lines, even though it's not much, I agree with. If I pull that off of, say, a farm customer, that cost still don't go away. So I would have to reassign that cost, maybe in another rate class, maybe to the rest of the ratepayers in that class. So in that sense, to try to keep equitable rates so that everyone contributes to the overall cost of the co-op, it's very difficult. It's not perfect. I agree with you. It's not perfect. But what I have to, when I go through this rate design and present it to the board, I got to make sure that this customer over here in this rate class don't pay and subsidize for this customer over here in this rate class. If I could eliminate that cost and it don't get transferred to someone else, I would be doing exactly what you're kind of indicating. Is that I'm only using a light bulb. I pay over here, but if you look at the components you're paying over here, like for your grain drying or operation, where you got hog operation, cattle, what have you, basically 60% of what you're paying, this is ballpark, is for generation, Buckeye's cost. The other 40% that you're paying for is the plant investments that you saw that Bill presented, the substations, the lines, and all of that. And I get it. Nobody wants increases in cost. I don't even want it. But the reality of it is, if you're sitting in my seat and you're saying, I want to be fair to all our members, where can I take, if I could take that cost of you, where can I put it? And the only place I can put it is let someone else pay for it. That, I know it's not satisfying you, but I hope you see that in utility rate making, and I can tell you AEP does the same thing. The difference between an AEP and a Hancock-Wood, the rate strategies are all the same. These are standard, Larry can attest to this, these are standard rate strategies. The difference is this, especially with customer charge. They have more units. The average number of consumers per mile of line for an investor-owned utility, these are averages, are 34. Guess what the average number of consumers, because we serve the farm community. The average number of consumers in the electric co-op, and this is pretty typical of electric co-ops, in Hancock-Wood's case, it's 7. And so we have to spread this cost over less people. And I can tell you, here's the thing that you may not realize. Where we manage these costs to a point where our rates are very competitive neck to neck with an entity that has more customers. I can tell you, and I'm going to show you some bills here, some actual bills of Ohio Power. We're at, on a residential account, and again, I'll mention that these bills are bills from employees wherever we could get them. Because if you go to their rate tariffs, you're not going to be able to interpret it with the riders and stuff that they place on their bills. We pull some bills from employees. One of them you're going to see is my bill. I use 4,700 kilowatt hours in the month of January. It's the highest I've ever used. But because I got a geothermal, a lot of my strip heat, 28 days strip heat, was heating my home during that time. My average cost from AT, this is generation, transmission, everything, and you'll see it here shortly, was about 12.6 cents, somewhere in that range. We got the calculation on the sheet up there. 12.6 cents. But I looked at some of the, and I'm one AEP system, okay, where my house is located, it's not in Hancock-Wood service area. When I looked at other rates on Hancock-Wood's rate, we're at 13.1, somewhere in that neighborhood. Now, the difference is that we manage costs very closely. But can I will I ever have to put an increase through? Yeah, I have to. But we watch that very closely to see, are we competitive? I can't change the cost. The costs are what they are, as we incur our generation, our distribution charge. But I can operate as efficiently as possible inside this organization so that we're not 20 cents higher than an AEP. we're neck and neck with them. 12.6 compared to 13.1. We measured it with similar type kilowatt hours so that we knew we were comparing closer apples to apples. We put a small adder onto everyone's bill, every member's bill, that generates a small amount of money per year for us to get more active in economic development. In fact, what it does, and specifically, it allows us to market our service territory to companies. I can tell you, Kurt, that I introduced at the beginning, Kurt's job every day is to attract companies to this service territory, and then we do specific designs on rates to lure them in, because everything's competitive today. And if we are able and successful, which I think there's going to be some success, and we'll communicate that to our members, of bringing more sales into this co-op. But I hope to be able to do it in annual meetings to tell you, because we brought these sales in, there's no increase on that second year. And it's not going to happen in 1 year, and I'm not going to throw that out there. But I'm saying over time, as we bring more sales and bring more growth into the co-op, that is what stabilizes rates. No different than the AEP. You got First Energy going bankrupt. I mean, they're filing for bankruptcy. And it's all because there's no growth here in the state of Ohio. No substantial growth like we used to see. That's what's driving rates and these rate increases. It's not that the co-op is a nonprofit organization. Let's just go out there and bring more of your money back into this co-op. But we did a pretty good, oh, I'm sorry.
You have enough power to get over to that lipstick area.
Oh, plenty.
Because that's all industrial, all the way to Belmore.
But here's the investment that we got to make. When we start serving loads, substation, we're getting transmission. But I can tell you, in the lipstick area, we got a 138 kV substation.
Okay.
Right there by Protec. It's on Protec's grounds.
It's right next to the east side of it.
Yeah. So we've got, and that's one of the things that, I didn't do that, that was my predecessor. He kind of positioned us well to be able to take a tap where AEP ran that 138 kV line, so we didn't have to pay for it. And all we paid for was just a tap right onto that 138 kV line.
So that main line is not AEP's?
That is AEP's. The transmission on that main 138 kV line is AEP's, but remember, we don't own transmission.
Okay.
We purchase transmission services from the transmission provider, and that's across the state for all the co-ops.
Okay.
We serve Mars.
Yeah, we serve the
we serve the
Mars plant.
pet food plant over there.
Okay.
Any other questions? I know I've kept you longer, pretty long, and but I want to make sure. Tom, yes.
Real quick, through all this, you do not have any of the patronage dividends we pay back to our members.
No,
That's all above that.
that's right. That tends to lower your average cost from the patronage end of it. We put out anywhere between, it was low this last year because we were at a rate increase. And so we pay those out, retire your patronage accounts on a yearly basis. Comes as a credit on your bills based on the co-op's ability to pay. We've always had some amount out there. Other years, we put over $1.5 million out there that we retired out of your equity accounts.